When entrepreneurs say, I want to be in a place that I can have my capital, deployed and mitigate the risk and have a quality, affordable cost of living, Youngstown and Mahoney Valley. So I think it's positioned to benefit from those factors.
"40 Years of the Business Journal" is sponsored by Compco and these participating sponsors.
This would have been in the 70s, living on 55 West Dewey Avenue. I remember living, my parents owned a brick duplex, and we had family who lived, they were neighbors who were his closest family who lived next door. A girl at the time, she's a woman now, her name was Popcorn, or her nickname was Popcorn. And I just remember growing up on Dewey Avenue. It was just several blocks from the church, Mount Calvary, that ended up going to for the vast majority of my life. It was right off of Market Street, not far from South High School. So that was some of my earliest memories of Youngstown, or growing up on Dewey Avenue and sort of starting from there.
What was your first job in Youngstown?
My first job in Youngstown. So my first unofficial job in Youngstown was probably working with my father. Well, no, before that it was probably shoveling driveways on the east side, when we lived on the east side, when we'd have snow days. My friend Irvin Walton, who lived next door on Early Road, we would shovel driveways. So that was my first sort of unofficial. Then I worked with my dad doing blacktopping driveways in the summertime. Was sort of my next structured job. I remember going down to the asphalt plant down on, near past the Himrod Avenue Expressway. I can't think of the name, where the YMHA development is. There was an asphalt plant there, so coming home smelling like kerosene and asphalt. And then working at McDonald's on McCartney Road. So those are my series of jobs that I remember very vividly in my early and mid-teens.
What was your first professional job after you'd gone to school and gotten
My first professional job was at, I'm not going to count retail. So I did retail at JCPenney. I did retail at a women's clothing store that has long since departed. But my first office professional job, where you sort of wear the tie and the collared shirt, was a bank teller at what was then First Federal Savings and Loan Association of Youngstown, which became First Federal, First Place Bank. And it was a job fair at Youngstown State University. I think I was probably a sophomore, and I was hired on the spot by Jill Mayfield, who to this day still claims that, rightfully, as a teller. And that led to my career in banking.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get to next. Okay, you said you were hired when you were a sophomore in college.
Right.
At that point, were you intending to go into finance?
No.
Or what was the game plan for Jay Williams at that time?
I was an engineering major. I wanted to be an aerospace engineer. And after a few bouts with calculus, I was like, wow, man, this is going to be tough. So as it would happen, I was working at the bank, and they had a management training program. And they said, typically, we don't offer this until you graduate, but because we know you're at the bank, we'd like to offer you an opportunity to enter into a management training program, but it's full-time. So I ended up going to school full-time my junior and senior year at night at Youngstown State and working full-time during the day. And the kicker was they said, oh, by the way, if you have a business or a finance or an accounting major, we will help reimburse some of your tuition. So I was like, oh, and I don't have to take calculus? I can take business calculus instead of, engineering calculus. So I switched my major to business administration with a concentration in finance, entered into the management training program. Like I said, I went to school at night full-time, worked full-time during the day at the bank, and that's how I got into banking. That was my foray into banking.
Now, how long did you work in banking?
I worked in banking for a total of 10 years. So I worked at First Federal of Youngstown for 4 or 5 years. I left there to go to the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, worked there for 2 or 3 years. And then I came back, and the idea was hopefully I'd come back to banking and be able to move up. And then I came back to First Federal of Warren, and First Federal of Youngstown, First Federal of Warren merged to become First Place Bank. And I worked there for another 2 or 3 years. So total 10 years between being a teller, being a branch manager, a vice president, running the lending operations, 3 years as a commercial bank examiner. So 10 years in banking.
What led you to go into public service?
Great question. So the bank grew, was changing, had gotten into commercial banking, less about relationship banking. It was less appealing to me. They were going into the secondary market, which was fine, but wasn't appealing to me. And the city of Youngstown was advertising for a director of community development. And I submitted my resume, got through the interview process, and was invited to have an interview with George McKelvey. And Mayor McKelvey and I talked, and he interviewed me. He said, well, why would you want to leave banking? You're probably making pretty good money, which I was. The bank had just gone public, so there were some stock options that were vesting. And I told him, I said, Youngstown's where I grew up, Mayor, and the community development director position as it's described is very appealing to me. Neighborhood level in the city. And he said, Jay, if you are willing to forego a banking career and all the things that come with that, he said, I would be a fool not to hire you. And George McKelvey then said, fill out the rest of the paperwork, do all the things you need to do. And he hired me. So that's when I left the bank. And I remember telling the president of the bank, that I was leaving. And he said, that's interesting. But he said, public service is a dead-end job. Why would you want to go work for the city? Those are dead-end jobs. And I said, I think otherwise. I appreciate everything that I've learned at the bank. But this to me is very appealing to come work in the city and do the things that were described as part of the job as Director of Community Development, CDA. So he said, okay. And I left and I started working for the city of Youngstown as Director of the Community Development Agency in October of 2000.
Of course, within a few years, you were at least the face, if not actually spearheading the Youngstown 2010 movement. How did that come about?
That came about as a result of the Mayor McKelvey and City Council had been doing research around, some other cities that had to redefine themselves. I think Chattanooga, there was a plan around Chattanooga around 2000 that was really putting Chattanooga on a map in terms of going from an older industrial city. It was, I think, ranked as one of the worst cities to live, or one of the most polluted cities, something to that effect. And Mayor McKelvey and some of the council members were studying that and came back, and they started allocating block grant funds for a planning and envisioning initiative. As Director of Community Development, naturally that was something that ran through my department. And I remember the mayor saying, Jay, this is a huge project that you'll have an opportunity to be a part of. The planning director, deputy director of planning, Bill D'Avignon, and I, and Anthony Koback, who was a planner. So the three of us were sort of charged with leading this on behalf of the city. We partnered with Youngstown State University. At that point, Dr. Sweet was president of the university. He had brought in Hunter Morrison, former planning director for the city of Cleveland. So with the full support of Mayor McKelvey and the allocation of resources from City Council, we hired a firm out of Toronto, Canada, Urban Strategies. And they came in and responded to an RFP, and really that just kicked off this series of meetings and discussions and visioning exercises for probably, remember it was maybe a year-long series of, that ultimately became Youngstown 2010, that set the framework for the city, that little did I know also became the source of inspiration of deciding to run for mayor.
What was the thinking behind you deciding to run for mayor?
It happened in an odd way. So Mayor McKelvey was termed out. He was a huge supporter of the plan. Again, without Mayor McKelvey's support and him giving me the autonomy and the leeway to execute the plan, I'm not confident I would have run or been successful in running for mayor. But what happened was, the idea was that we had spent a considerable amount of time, and residents and businesses of the city had spent time formulating and sharing their thinking around this visioning and this planning. And we knew the mayoral election was coming up, so we had a framework. And we took that framework to the major candidates, the candidates who had identified themselves as running for mayor. And we hoped and expected that they would say, great, this is the platform that we should be running on, because we just spent 12 to 18 months going throughout every corner of the city, talking to residents and businesses, neighborhood groups, elected officials about the future of Youngstown. And the response was tepid at best, was, oh, that's nice, but that's not going to be the platform that we adopt. And we went to each of the major identified candidates, and none of them were interested in embracing this and seeing this as a platform. So,
in other words, the response was, here's a shelf with the other plans.
Right.
This can join.
Right, exactly. And people know me. I've been around. I'm going to raise a lot of money. This is not how you run. This is how you run for mayor. We'll talk about that later. There was a huge concern that this would be seen as a self-defeating sort of slap in the face, that the citizens just spent considerable time and effort and energy putting their voices to this plan, and then seeing that there was a mayoral election where this plan wasn't front and center. So, there was discussion among a small group of us, and I said, listen, we can't let this happen. So I thought about, well, if I run for mayor, people don't know who I am politically. They've seen me out in front of this plan, but I'm going to run for mayor to make the plan the center part of the discussion. May not win, but will force the candidates to talk about this plan. And in doing that and doing the research, I realized that I was going to, I was informed that I would have to resign because the Hatch Act wouldn't allow me to oversee federal funds and participate in political activity. So, long story short, talked to some folks and said, let's do this. I'm going to resign, run for mayor, and force the debate about this. Well, as it would happen, people said, yeah, this is exactly what the mayoral race should be about, the future of Youngstown and this Youngstown 2010. And they said, we don't know why the other candidates don't also think that. And, as a result, people said, yeah, we know who this guy is. Like, now you're running for mayor and this is your platform. And others don't see this as an important platform. So, as a result, it took me from being a political neophyte, having never held office and having never run for office, to running on a plan that was designed for all of the candidates to run on. And ultimately, people said, well, yeah, that's what we think should be the discussion of the next mayoral administration. And that was the inspiration to run. That was a platform to run. And again, I didn't do it. There was some cynicism like, oh, he just got involved in Youngstown 2010 to run for mayor. Nothing could be further from the truth. But I did run because we felt it was important for that at least to be a major part, if not the primary part, of the mayoral election. And even if I didn't win, was going to make sure that plan survived, but ended up winning and said, well, this is you know what I'm about. This is what I'm about.
What would you say were the biggest challenges you faced during your term as mayor?
Challenges that mayors for the past 20 years have faced: economics, the crime rate, the school system. Even though in Youngstown, the mayor doesn't have an appointment to the school system, doesn't oversee the superintendent, it's still your issue. It's your baby. But I think the top three were, the economics, the rate of crime, and how it spiked and ebbed and flowed, and the challenge around the schools. Because at that point, we had started to redefine, and the narrative around Youngstown's reputation had begun to change. What I used to say is, I wanted to be a part of the city that was no longer defined by its failures, but instead defined by its approach to its future. But those three things were the things that weighed on me, I think, most heavily during my term.
I want to stop at the economics, because obviously you're mayor for a couple of years, and boom, there's a housing crash. There's the global financial crisis,
right.
And here you are, already dealing with a city that has struggled
right.
consistently
right.
to recover from the loss of the steel industry, and then you got this huge global thing layered on top of it.
But it's a blessing and a curse. We were already accustomed to dealing with economic calamity. So frankly, I said it a little bit cynically, like, oh, so now the rest of the world or the country gets to experience what it's been like in Youngstown for the past 30 years. So we knew how to operate on a shoestring budget. We knew what economic crisis looked like. We knew what deficits, battling budgets had to be put together. So in that regard, it really wasn't significantly worse because, again, this is what Youngstown had been battling. So if anything, it brought some appreciation and empathy to how creative and resilient Youngstown had been to survive. There are cities that went through less severe downturns than Youngstown went through that today still are struggling to, not that Youngstown, is completely out of that or doesn't struggle, but if anything, I think it brought some appreciation and empathy to the creativity, the resilience, the innovation, the spirit of Youngstown to survive what it did prior to the global economic collapse, during the global economic collapse, and in fact, frankly, gave us a platform to talk about some of the things that we were doing that would help recover the economy of not just Youngstown, but similarly situated cities. And I remember having conversations on C-SPAN and national outlets and saying, listen, this is what crisis is what we do, for better or for worse. I'd like to do something else, but we've survived, this is how, and here are lessons that we're happy to share with other communities across the country.
How did Youngstown change most during your term, and what high point, what would you say are the high points?
I think Youngstown changed most back to what I said of, it was a city that people stopped as consistently defining it by its failures. The cliche tagline of Youngstown about being the poster child of the industrial Rust Belt, the collapse of urban centers, showing the old rusted out steel mills being demolished. And it started being talked about a city that was embracing its shrinkage, that was figuring out how to be a smaller, more relevant, resilient city. And again, during that period of time, I was invited to Germany and to many other places in Europe to talk about Youngstown's approach. The New York Times listed Youngstown 2010 as one of the most innovative thinking, forward-looking plans. There were national editorials about what places like Detroit and other cities could learn from Youngstown, Ohio. So to me, that was one of the most significant changes, is that there was less of a defeatist attitude. There was less of talk about our best days were behind us and being defined by September 19th, 1977, when the mills closed. So being able to be a part of that narrative, and again, this was attributable to many, many people and many players and many stakeholders, not singularly me as mayor. To me, that was the biggest change that occurred during those years for the city. We're doing Youngstown 2010. President Obama is running. This area is largely and firmly behind Senator Clinton, who I think is probably the most qualified person ever to run for the office.
Tim Ryan, a friend of yours, very
absolutely.
heavy supporter of
absolutely. And I initially was too. Herb Washington has a fundraiser at his house for then Senator Obama.
I remember.
Mark Dan is supposed to introduce Senator Obama. I'm supposed to introduce Mark Dan. Mark Dan doesn't show up. So I get moved up to introduce then Senator Obama, just sort of as this odd, like, oh.
Yeah.
Long story short, meet him, decide to endorse, happy to do what I can as a surrogate, and he wins. And again, I have no intention on joint administration. That was a rumor. I was like, no, I'm loving being mayor. I'm about to be in my second term as mayor.
Yeah, you're running for re-election.
I'm running for re-election, so yeah, I'm not going anywhere. So 2009 comes.
And you win.
And I win. And my secretary, Felicia Carpenter, calls one day into the office and said the White House is on the phone. And I was like, oh, okay. And that initial call happens about being the auto recovery czar, but the conversation is around, hey, what you all have been doing in Youngstown is so important to other cities across the country. Would you be interested? That's we've seen what you and your team have been doing. Gary, Indiana, Bethlehem, Flint. I mean, there's so many cities that need this, urban and rural. So that's where the conversation starts.
Who did you talk to?
That was Brian Deese. Brian Deese was one of my early folks who called. In fact, he was probably the first person to call. So that started a conversation. And let me just take it one step back. When you talk about running against the establishment, the first visit that I got from the campaign Obama team was about, hey, you just ran against the establishment candidate in Youngstown, Ohio, never had a black mayor. Tell us what that was like. So that was the first thing they were interested prior to. So then after the election, Brian Deese, go back and forth to DC, we talk about it. This goes on for about a year. I think the midterms, Republicans had taken charge of the House, or were right, the budget, they started sort of trying to defund everything. My wife was like, don't tell me about another conversation you've had with the White House until they either say, you're coming to DC, or they say, no, thank you. About a year, I keep getting these calls. They call at 7 in the morning. So long story short, finally they say, we got it done. We got the budget, you got to go. And then they say, hey, we want you here in 2 weeks. And I said, I'm the mayor of Youngstown. I can't give a 2-week notice. First of all, my wife and I need to talk about this, pray about it, get some, I just got reelected. I take this seriously. So I was like, 2 weeks isn't going to work, so I don't know what to tell you. Long story short, they didn't want anybody to know about it. It was strategically leaked, sort of that I was talking. They called, they were a little bit upset, but I said, listen, I can't just leave. This is a community that I love, that has defined me. So we finally worked through that, and it's formally announced that I'm going to DC. One of the most difficult, probably the most difficult professional decision I've had to make, both heart-wrenching and exhilarating at the same time, but that's ultimately how that ended up, and I ended up at the auto recovery office heading that up.
And then you eventually shift commerce for a role in economic development. Yeah,
there's a stint in the White House, so I do the auto recovery office. Then I go do about a year plus as Deputy Director of Intergovernmental Affairs at the White House while I was still doing the auto recovery office. Then they said the auto recovery office is going to wind down. And they had a couple of positions they asked me to consider. Assistant Secretary at HUD for Community Planning and Development with then Sean, I can't think of Sean's name. He was the HUD Director. And right when I thought I was about to accept that, it was on a Saturday, the Presidential Personnel Office called and said, hey, we got this other thing that we want to talk to you about called EDA. And my eyes lit up, coming from Youngstown, doing economic development. So I remember telling the HUD folks, I appreciate it, but I'm going over to Commerce to head up EDA. So President nominates me, Senate goes through its confirmation process. Tim Ryan, certainly, 100% supportive. Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown both agreed to put me up for nomination before the Senate in a bipartisan fashion, and I'm confirmed and go from the White House then to heading up the Economic Development Administration.
Obviously, after the Obama administration ends, you eventually end up at Hartford.
Right.
How's that been going?
It was great. So there was a flirtation with the gubernatorial race. Really targeting to be lieutenant governor, because often a lieutenant governor headed up the Ohio Department of Development, which was an appeal. So went through some interviews across the country, and Hartford Foundation opportunity just was like, I couldn't design a more appealing opportunity to head up a community foundation in a city and region not dissimilar to Youngstown, larger but not dissimilar. With $1 billion endowment, with a board of directors is saying we need a change agent. This is a great organization, but it has become a little bit stagnant, and we need to sort of lean into a more relevant and nimble future. And I said, man, that's like an open invitation. And interviewed, and thankfully the board said, okay, this guy maybe has some potential, and have been there for now 7 years.
What have been the biggest changes that you've seen? Yep. I mean, not just in recent years, but just looking back from when you were growing up.
Yeah. We're sitting in one of them in the middle of downtown. So as a kid, I remember coming downtown with my mother to Strauss to get a chocolate malt in the mezzanine. And when I got a little older, she would give me her black and white Strauss charge card to come down and buy, some clothes. And Silver's Vogue shop where I'd go get my Easter suits and put suits in layaway, and Learners where I'd follow my mother in, and Tops and Bottoms and the shoe stores. So the transformation of downtown, the fact that we're sitting in a hotel in downtown Youngstown, a very nice hotel. Those transformations, I think the transformation of Youngstown State University, my alma mater. I mean, that campus is not the campus that I graduated from in 1994. And I mean that positively. The student housing, the retail activity is just breathtaking. The major corridors of the city, that was always something that we targeted. Just look and feel differently. You see development in neighborhoods to a positive extent. That being said, there's still, heartbreaking challenges in terms of still, neighborhoods that still need more investment, that still need more people. And I think that, and I'm still pleased that Youngstown's reputation, while still takes its lumps and has its ups and downs, is less talk about this Rust Belt city with nothing relevant to offer, and that's most important because the people of this town, I've been across the country and across the globe in many instances, and I've yet to have an instance where I don't meet someone from Youngstown or who has a story about Youngstown, and immediately there's this connection. It happened in DC, it happened in Europe, it happens at Hartford, it's happened across this country.
What still holds Youngstown back?
Yeah, Youngstown, public education there has to be some, and this isn't just a Youngstown issue, but it certainly is one of the things that continues to hold Youngstown back. The issue around crime and disinvestment and crime that has so many contributing factors to it. I still daily check both with regularity the Business Journal website and the app that I have, and the Vindicator Tribune app, and I am still impacted when I see a crime, a homicide or a shooting or some event, and it's just so frustrating. And I think to me that issue, more than so many others, is still has to be solved or addressed or mitigated. There's a whole host of other things, but that to me is what stands out in terms of just that. Getting to the core of that really is probably the biggest thing that unlocks Youngstown's full potential.
What do you see in Youngstown's future?
Great question. I see a city that continues to be just on the cusp of its full potential. I think that, if the university, which is an asset, in many instances, I'll reserve my commentary on my frustration on the leadership process. But if the university, I think aligns itself in the city, I think that we still have to see Youngstown and the region as complementary components of a larger approach. That this is a city that has the potential to attract investment, to attract residents. When you think about what's happening across other parts of the country, there are still rich natural resources here. There's an abundance of water. There's Mill Creek Park. There's a city that can accommodate an influx, whether it's whenever we figure out the immigration issue in this country, which has to be solved, when people from other parts say, climate change and arid conditions and whatever the case is, and when entrepreneurs say, I want to be in a place that I can have my capital, deployed and mitigate the risk and have a quality, affordable cost of living, Youngstown and Mahoney Valley. So I think it's positioned to benefit from those factors. The Mahoney River is one of the most underutilized assets in the city and in the region and in the valley. Communities that have figured out how to embrace their bodies of water thrive. Communities that don't have them can't get them. So whether it's a lake or a river like we have here, the removal of those dams, the continued investment in the Mahoney River, just is a natural resource that can't be replicated.
"40 Years of the Business Journal" is sponsored by Compco and these participating sponsors.